Picture this moment. German military commanders stand frozen along the Atlantic coast, their eyes scanning a sight so overwhelming it defies everything their superiors had drilled into them. The date? June 6, 1944. The scene? An endless procession of Allied vessels blanketing the English Channel, thousands upon thousands stretching beyond the limits of vision. Above them, wave after wave of Allied warplanes thunder across the sky, in formations so dense they literally obscure the rising sun. This wasn't the crumbling, fractured America that Nazi propaganda machinery had spent years describing to them. Not even close. What these officers witnessed was raw industrial dominance operating at a level that seemed almost incomprehensible. A demonstration of productive capacity so massive it bordered on the unbelievable. Just 14 days following this historic invasion, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, serving as Commander-in-Chief West, would submit his official military assessment. His comprehensive 3,100-word analysis would cut straight to the heart of why the Allies were succeeding, identifying one overwhelming factor above all others: the invaders' absolute and total control of the airspace. We're talking about 29,000 Allied air missions flown in merely 2.5 days. That's roughly 2,300 aircraft every single day, relentlessly dive-bombing and machine-gunning anything that moved on the ground below. Even individual soldiers weren't safe. German tank units found it literally impossible to maneuver in daylight across open terrain. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. What von Rundstedt witnessed that June morning was actually the physical culmination of a catastrophic miscalculation the Germans had made 3 full years earlier. Let's rewind to a winter evening, specifically the night spanning January 8th and 9th, 1942. Adolf Hitler sits in his military headquarters, delivering one of his characteristic evening lectures. His words are being carefully documented by Heinrich Heim and Martin Bormann for what history would later call Hitler's table talk. The Führer speaks with unwavering confidence about the United States of America. Listen to what he actually said. Everything about the behavior of American society reveals that it is half-Judaized and the other half negrified. How can one expect a state like that to hold together? A state where 80% of the revenue is drained away for the public purse, a country where everything is built on the dollar. Now, here's the critical point you need to understand. This wasn't just inflammatory rhetoric designed for public consumption. This represented the absolute core of Nazi ideological thinking, the fundamental worldview that would shape German strategic military planning and, ultimately, contribute directly to the Third Reich's complete destruction. Hitler had actually voiced similar sentiments publicly just 1 month before this private conversation. On December 11th, 1941, standing before the Reichstag to formally declare war against the United States, he proclaimed that everything America hadn't inherited from Europe might seem impressive to a Jewified mixed race, but that Europe viewed such achievements as nothing more than symptoms of cultural and artistic decay, the inevitable result of what he called Jewish or Negroid blood mixture. The truly frightening aspect? The Nazi leadership genuinely, sincerely believed these racial theories weren't propaganda. They were convinced these ideas represented objective truth. They had persuaded themselves that racial diversity inherently weakened nations, that Jewish influence inevitably corrupted entire societies, that democratic systems made countries fundamentally incapable of effective military action. These weren't cynical falsehoods manufactured purely for German public consumption. These formed the bedrock beliefs that fundamentally shaped how German leadership assessed both their enemies' capabilities and their own military strength. For years leading up to the war, Nazi propaganda had worked systematically to portray America as a civilization in terminal, irreversible decline. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister and the architect of Nazi information warfare, orchestrated an unrelenting media campaign through his influential weekly newspaper, Das Reich. On August 9, 1942, Goebbels published a scathing piece ridiculing America as God's country, writing that if the nation were left to rely solely on its own resources, it would soon return once more to desert and prairie, as wide and as empty as the souls of its people. He systematically portrayed America as completely dependent on European civilization for anything of genuine value, depicting it as an immature land fundamentally lacking culture, proper education, and meaningful history. Goebbels reserved particularly venomous attacks for American military leadership. His June 7, 1942 article titled Heroes and Film Heroes specifically targeted General Douglas MacArthur, branding him a coward for evacuating from Bataan before the April 10, 1942 surrender. Comparing MacArthur unfavorably to German General Scherer, whose unit had held their position for 107 days while completely cut off, Goebbels concluded that the momentary fame of American film heroes will have melted along with the wax in Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. Hermann Göring, serving as Reich Marshal and commander of the Luftwaffe, perfectly embodied this dismissive mindset with his infamous assertion that Americans could only manufacture refrigerators and razor blades. He insisted they would never possess the capability to produce the sophisticated military equipment and supplies necessary to defeat Nazi Germany. And here's what you need to understand. This wasn't merely wartime posturing for morale purposes. It reflected the genuine, deeply held belief among German leadership in America's supposed industrial inadequacy. The propaganda themes remained remarkably consistent across all Nazi media. Racial intermixing made America fundamentally weak. Jewish control corrupted its entire leadership structure. Plutocratic capitalism divided its population against itself. American soldiers completely lacked the fighting spirit inherent in German troops. German newspapers routinely published political cartoons depicting President Franklin Roosevelt with deliberately exaggerated Jewish facial features, strongly suggesting he was merely a puppet controlled by international Jewish conspirators. Magazine covers portrayed American cities as cesspools of moral corruption, where jazz music, which the Nazis specifically associated with Black Americans, had supposedly poisoned the culture beyond any hope of recovery. The narrative was elegantly simple and dangerously seductive to those predisposed to believe it. America possessed no unified national character, no pure racial identity to rally its people around. How could such a mongrel nation possibly mount an effective challenge against the racially homogeneous and ideologically unified German Reich? The Wehrmacht officers believed it completely. The German civilian population believed it. Even as America formally entered the war in December 1941, Nazi leadership remained supremely confident that this soft, divided democracy would crumble rapidly when confronted by the battle-hardened warriors of the Third Reich. German military analysts had carefully studied American performance in World War I and drawn largely dismissive conclusions from that examination. Yes, America had eventually deployed troops to Europe between 1917 and 1918, but those soldiers had required extensive, remedial training from French and British forces before being considered genuinely battle-ready. The United States Army of 1918 numbered fewer than 200,000 personnel before conscription began. Surely, the Nazi strategists reasoned, this was simply not a nation built or prepared for modern mechanized warfare. Hitler himself expressed nothing but pure contempt for American military potential. In private discussions with his inner circle, he openly mocked the very idea that Americans could manufacture quality weaponry or field properly disciplined armies. He pointed repeatedly to what he perceived as American obsession with comfort and entertainment culture. How could a nation addicted to Hollywood movies and consumer goods possibly develop the martial spirit necessary for total warfare? The Führer's entire worldview simply couldn't accommodate the possibility that a multi-ethnic democracy might actually possess strategic advantages that his supposedly racially pure dictatorship fundamentally lacked. Now, when Hitler declared war on the United States on December 11th, 1941, 4 days following Pearl Harbor, he approached this decision with a peculiar mixture of perceived inevitability and profound disdain. He viewed the formal declaration as merely acknowledging a state of war that Roosevelt had supposedly been waging covertly for months through the Lend-Lease aid program to Britain and increasingly aggressive naval patrols throughout the Atlantic. But Hitler's strategic calculation was fundamentally, catastrophically flawed. He assumed that America, already fully committed to war against Japan in the Pacific Theater, would find itself completely unable to mount any significant military operations in Europe for several years. By that time, he confidently believed, Germany would have secured total victory over the Soviet Union and consolidated an absolutely impregnable fortress Europe. German war planners compiled extensive lists documenting everything America supposedly lacked: authentic military tradition, a professional officer corps, meaningful combat experience, modern armored vehicles, strategic bomber capability. The catalog went on and on. What these planners completely failed to grasp was this crucial distinction. America's weaknesses were temporary and correctable, while its fundamental strengths were structural and absolutely enormous. The United States possessed something Germany desperately needed but could never acquire in sufficient quantity: natural resources and industrial manufacturing capacity on a truly continental scale. Throughout 1942 and extending into 1943, Nazi leadership observed with mounting anxiety as intelligence reports filtered back from the North African theater. American soldiers, inexperienced and green, had initially stumbled badly. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 seemed to thoroughly confirm German assumptions of superiority. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps inflicted a devastating defeat on American forces in the Tunisian mountains. The casualty statistics appeared to validate every single Nazi stereotype they had promoted: 6,300 American casualties, including 300 killed outright, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 missing or captured. German forces, by contrast, suffered merely 989 casualties total, with 201 killed, 536 wounded, and 252 missing. American material losses were absolutely staggering: 183 tanks destroyed, 104 half-tracks lost, 208 artillery pieces eliminated, and 512 trucks either destroyed or captured. German forces even seized 57,000 gallons of precious gasoline and 45 tons of ammunition. German propaganda immediately seized upon Kasserine Pass as definitive proof that American soldiers fundamentally lacked fighting spirit. Nazi newspapers triumphantly proclaimed that American troops broke ranks and fled when confronted by professional German soldiers. Radio broadcasts openly mocked American military competence. Goebbels declared this was the inevitable result when a mongrel nation attempted to wage war against warriors possessing pure blood and iron will. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. Experienced German field commanders noticed something deeply troubling in the battle's aftermath. Rommel himself, the Desert Fox, recognized what Nazi propagandists deliberately chose to ignore. In his personal journal, Rommel wrote that the tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class. He noted they had recovered very quickly after the first shock, and had soon succeeded in damming up our advance by grouping their reserves to defend the passes and other suitable points. Later in the Rommel papers, he acknowledged even more directly. Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. He wrote that although they would have to wait until the campaign against Patton's army in France to witness the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare, the desert battlefield had already revealed something crucial. The Desert Fox, one of Germany's most genuinely capable commanders, had recognized something that Hitler and Goebbels flatly refused to see. The Americans learned incredibly quickly. They adapted their tactics with remarkable speed. And most alarming of all from a German perspective, their equipment kept arriving in absolutely staggering quantities. By May 1943, just 3 months after their defeat at Kasserine Pass, American forces had driven Axis armies completely out of North Africa. General Jürgen von Arnim surrendered, along with approximately 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers in Tunisia. The real lesson of Kasserine Pass wasn't American incompetence, it was American adaptability. The capacity to learn from crushing defeat, reorganize rapidly, and return significantly stronger was precisely the kind of institutional flexibility that rigid authoritarian systems struggled desperately to match. While Nazi propaganda continued mockingly dismissing American industrial capacity, the reality unfolding across the Atlantic was staggering beyond any reasonable comprehension. The production numbers were so extreme that German intelligence officers who faithfully reported them were sometimes actually accused of exaggeration or defeatist thinking. But the numbers were absolutely real, verified, documented, and growing exponentially every single month. In 1943 alone, America produced 29,497 tanks. This figure excluded other categories of armored fighting vehicles entirely. Total armored fighting vehicle production for 1943 reached 37,198 units. For perspective, consider this. Germany produced 26,925 tanks during the entire war spanning 1939 to 1945, 6 full years of total war mobilization. America built more tanks in one single year than Germany managed throughout the entire conflict. The Sherman tank became the ultimate symbol of the vast chasm between German perceptions and American reality. German tank crews initially dismissed the Sherman as distinctly inferior to their Panzer Mark IV and the fearsome Tiger tanks. The Sherman had thinner armor plating, mounted a less powerful main gun, and caught fire more readily when struck by enemy rounds. German crews sarcastically nicknamed it the Ronson, after a popular cigarette lighter, because it supposedly lit up on the first strike. But when German forces actually captured an intact Sherman tank called War Daddy II from the 1st Armored Division on February 22, 1943 in Tunisia, they immediately shipped it to Kummersdorf Weapons Testing Center for comprehensive technical evaluation. The German engineering assessment directly contradicted their own propaganda. The Sherman was exceptionally well built, remarkably reliable, and surprisingly comfortable for crew operations. German engineers specifically noted it was demonstrably superior in mechanical reliability compared to German tanks, describing it as an automotive masterpiece the Germans could only dream of producing. What German tankers fundamentally failed to appreciate was the profound strategic implication of American mass production philosophy. For every single Tiger tank Germany managed to produce, America was manufacturing dozens of Sherman tanks. Quality certainly matters in individual tank versus tank duels, but quantity ultimately determines who wins entire campaigns. A Tiger might successfully destroy 3 or 4 Shermans before being knocked out, but if America could deploy 20 Shermans for every single Tiger, the basic mathematics of attrition favored the Allies overwhelmingly and decisively. German armored units actually actively sought out captured Sherman tanks for their own operational use, particularly converting them into armored recovery vehicles. Tank recovery units operating in Italy specifically preferred captured Shermans precisely because of their extraordinary mechanical reliability compared to German vehicles that broke down with frustrating consistency. A German Africa Corps War Diary entry dated November 2, 1942, candidly noted that American-built tanks have an advantage over German tanks because they can successfully conduct a firefight at distances exceeding 1,000 meters. Aircraft production told an even more dramatic story of American industrial dominance. In 1943 alone, America produced 84,853 aircraft total, including 9,574 heavy bombers, 7,256 medium bombers, and 23,621 fighter aircraft. By 1944, production peaked at an absolutely staggering 96,270 aircraft. To put this in perspective, this exceeded Japan's entire aircraft production for the complete war, which totaled 76,220 aircraft manufactured between 1939 and 1945. American aircraft factories operated continuously on 3 shifts, functioning 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly, without pause. Women who had never previously worked in industrial facilities learned to rivet aluminum panels, install complex hydraulic systems, and assemble intricate instrument panels. By 1943, women comprised an astounding 65% of the aircraft industry workforce, up dramatically from merely 1% before the war began. The iconic Rosie the Riveter poster represented hundreds of thousands of real women whose dedicated labor made American air superiority not just possible, but inevitable. The Ford Motor Company constructed a massive manufacturing plant at Willow Run, Michigan, designed specifically to mass-produce B-24 Liberator bombers using automotive assembly techniques. The factory sprawled across an incredible 3.5 million square feet, making it the largest single production facility under one roof anywhere in the world. At peak employment, Willow Run utilized 42,000 workers, including over 15,000 women. The B-24 Liberator was an extraordinarily complex flying machine, containing approximately 1,850,000 individual parts, compared to roughly 15,000 parts in an average automobile. Yet Ford's revolutionary assembly line techniques, brilliantly adapted for aircraft production, achieved mass production rates that military planners had previously considered physically impossible. At maximum production capacity in 1944, Willow Run completed one fully operational B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Peak monthly production reached an astonishing 428 complete bombers in April 1944 alone. Total Willow Run production reached 8,685 B-24s, representing nearly half of all B-24 Liberators built by all manufacturers combined during the entire war. These bombers would systematically pound German industrial capacity, methodically destroy transportation networks, and establish the air superiority that would ultimately make D-Day operationally feasible. Ford workers assembling bombers at Willow Run were fighting the war just as surely as the pilots who would eventually fly those aircraft over Europe. The Liberty Ship program perfectly exemplified American industrial innovation applied brilliantly to naval construction. Initial Liberty Ship construction required 230 to 355 days in 1941. Through systematic improvement of mass production techniques pioneered by industrialist Henry Kaiser, average construction time plummeted to just 30 to 42 days by 1943. The record holder, SS Robert E. Peary, launched in exactly 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from initial keel laying on November 8th to formal launch on November 12th, 1942. While this was partially a propaganda achievement with significant fitting out work completed after the symbolic launch, regular production still maintained an extraordinary pace that seemed almost impossible. By 1943, America launched 3 complete Liberty ships every single day. Total Liberty ship production reached 2,510 vessels manufactured between 1941 and 1945. These ships carried the essential supplies that kept Allied armies actively fighting across multiple theaters. They transported tanks, trucks, ammunition, food supplies, fuel, and the millions of tons of material absolutely necessary for sustaining modern industrial warfare. German U-boats sank Allied merchant ships by the hundreds in desperate attempts to strangle supply lines. But American shipyards replaced losses faster than submarines could possibly sink them. Admiral Karl Dönitz watched helplessly as his entire strategy of starving Britain into submission collapsed under the crushing weight of American shipbuilding capacity. The sheer scale of American production extended systematically across every single category of military equipment. By 1944, the United States produced two-thirds of all Allied military equipment, 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million army trucks. More than half of all industrial production occurring anywhere in the world was taking place in the United States by war's end. American artillery particularly impressed German commanders who experienced it firsthand on the battlefield. Rommel wrote to his wife on February 18, 1943, during the Kasserine Pass battle, specifically noting the devastating effectiveness of American artillery coordination. An observation plane directed the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets throughout the zone, he observed with professional respect. German generals consistently documented in their reports that American artillery was demonstrably more mobile, featured larger calibers, achieved longer effective ranges, and enjoyed far better supply logistics than German equivalent systems. Once proximity fuses were deployed operationally, American artillery became utterly devastating in battlefield effect. These revolutionary fuses, developed in absolute secrecy, used miniature radar technology to detonate artillery shells at optimal height above ground level, dramatically increasing lethality against infantry formations and unarmored vehicles. German soldiers rapidly learned to fear American artillery above almost any other weapon system on the battlefield. The sheer volume of American shell production meant that American artillery units could sustain fire rates that German gunners could only dream of matching. The M1 Garand rifle provided individual American infantrymen with significant firepower advantages over German troops still equipped with bolt-action Kar 98K Mausers, while German units compensated somewhat with higher organizational densities of machine guns and submachine guns. The semi-automatic M1 allowed American riflemen to maintain sustained fire rates completely impossible with bolt-action weapons. General George Patton famously proclaimed the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised, and battlefield results proved his assessment accurate. Nazi ideology had insisted stubbornly that American industrial capacity was grossly exaggerated propaganda, that American workers were too soft and undisciplined to match German production efficiency, that Jewish influence and racial mixing had corrupted American society beyond any hope of military effectiveness. Every single one of these fundamental assumptions was catastrophically, demonstrably wrong. American democracy, messy, contentious, and apparently chaotic, proved far more resilient and adaptable than German dictatorship with its supposed efficiency. American mass production techniques originally developed for consumer goods translated brilliantly to weapons manufacture at scales that seemed impossible. American diversity, which Nazis viewed as a fatal, inherent weakness, became an unexpected source of strategic strength that Germany simply could not match or replicate. The proof lay not in propaganda rhetoric, but in the extraordinary diversity of Americans who actually built and effectively wielded the arsenal of democracy. The very people Hitler contemptuously dismissed as racial inferiors demonstrated capabilities that completely shattered Nazi racial theories. African-American soldiers, whom Nazi propaganda viciously portrayed as subhuman, proved their courage and genuine competence on battlefields throughout Europe and the Pacific. The Tuskegee Airmen systematically shattered every racist assumption about Black Americans' capabilities. Of 992 pilots trained between 1941 and 1946, 450 deployed overseas, flying 1,578 combat missions and accumulating over 15,000 combat sorties total. The Tuskegee Airmen destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in direct air-to-air combat, destroyed 150 additional aircraft on the ground, and damaged 148 more. Most remarkably, they lost only 27 bombers while flying escort missions, compared to an average of 46 bombers lost for other P-51 fighter groups. This represented the absolute lowest loss rate of any escort fighter group in the entire theater. Bomber crews specifically and repeatedly requested the Tuskegee Airmen as their escorts because they knew with absolute certainty these Black pilots would protect them with their lives. The unit collectively earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, and 744 Air Medals. 73 Tuskegee Airmen were killed in action, 3 became prisoners of war, and 21 received the Distinguished Flying Cross for exceptional valor. These were the men that Hitler's racial ideology insisted were inherently incapable of mastering complex machinery or demonstrating martial courage. Reality proved Hitler catastrophically, undeniably wrong. The 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, attached to General George Patton's Third Army in October 1944. They fought 183 consecutive days in continuous combat, participating in 4 major Allied campaigns across Europe. They successfully breached the heavily fortified Siegfried Line, liberated over 30 occupied towns, and were among the very first American units to link up with Soviet forces advancing from the east in Austria. The battalion suffered approaching 50% casualties, while inflicting an estimated 130,000 casualties on German forces throughout their combat operations. They earned 1 Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously in 1997, 11 Silver Stars, and approximately 300 Purple Hearts, plus a Presidential Unit Citation awarded in 1978, 33 years after the war ended. Patton, who had expressed openly racist views earlier in his military career, came to genuinely respect the Black Panthers' exceptional fighting ability and relied on them repeatedly in critical operations. The 92nd Infantry Division, the only African-American infantry division to see combat in the European theater, fielded approximately 15,000 officers and enlisted men fighting throughout Italy from October 1944 through May 1945. They suffered roughly 3,000 casualties, including over 400 killed, 1,500 wounded, and 500 missing or captured as prisoners of war. The unit earned 2 Medals of Honor, both awarded in 1997, 5 decades after the war, 208 Silver Stars, 1,166 Bronze Stars, and 1,191 Purple Hearts. They liberated the Italian cities of La Spezia and Genoa from German occupation. The Red Ball Express represented one of the most critical, yet historically least celebrated contributions to ultimate Allied victory. This massive truck convoy system, staffed by 75% African-American drivers totaling approximately 23,000 personnel, transported 412,193 tons of essential supplies over 82 days from August 25th to November 16th, 1944. They hauled desperately needed supplies from the Normandy beaches directly to the rapidly advancing front lines deep inside France. At peak operational capacity, 6,000 trucks transported 12,500 tons of supplies daily without interruption. Drivers worked around the clock in exhausting shifts, maintaining operational momentum even when physically exhausted beyond normal human endurance. General Patton called the 2.5-ton truck our most valuable weapon, publicly acknowledging that his legendary rapid advance across France depended entirely on this critical supply lifeline. Without the predominantly black drivers of the Red Ball Express working tirelessly behind the lines, Patton's tanks would have run completely out of fuel and ammunition within days, grinding his entire offensive to a halt. Overall, approximately 1 million to 1.2 million African Americans served honorably in the armed forces during World War II out of 2.5 million registered for the draft. This included approximately 1 million in the United States Army, 167,000 in the Navy, 17,000 in the Marine Corps, and 4,000 African American women serving in the Women's Army Corps. These soldiers served in a rigorously segregated military system, facing systematic discrimination and deep prejudice, even while fighting courageously for their country. Yet they served with remarkable distinction and undeniable courage, proving through direct action what Nazi racial ideology vehemently denied. They were not inferior. They were not incapable. They were Americans who genuinely loved their country and fought to defend it, even when that country did not yet grant them full equality under law. Jewish scientists fleeing Nazi persecution built the most devastating weapon in human history, the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project's roster reads like a comprehensive catalog of brilliant refugees from Hitler's insane racial policies. J. Robert Oppenheimer directed the entire project. Leo Szilard co-authored Einstein's historic letter to President Roosevelt and conducted the first controlled nuclear chain reaction alongside Enrico Fermi. Albert Einstein's revolutionary theories provided the essential theoretical foundation. Edward Teller, Hans Bethe, Niels Bohr, John von Neumann, Felix Bloch, Otto Frisch, Rudolf Peierls, Eugene Wigner, and Richard Feynman were among dozens of Jewish scientists whose exceptional brilliance Hitler had foolishly forced into permanent exile. These men, whom Nazi ideology officially classified as subhuman parasites corrupting German society, developed the ultimate weapon that would make American victory absolute and unquestionable. A contemporary observer noted that the vast majority of the Manhattan Project scientists were Jewish, and almost all of them were German, Hungarian, or Austrian refugees, fleeing Nazi racial policies specifically. Nazi ideology had literally driven the scientific talent that could have given them atomic weapons first directly into American hands. Hitler's racial theories had created his own absolute worst nightmare, a Jewish scientific brain trust working dedicatedly for America. The final bitter irony was now complete. Nazi Germany systematically expelled the very scientists who might have given them atomic weapons first. Those same scientists, welcomed by America's pluralistic society, built the bomb that would ensure Hitler's regime would be utterly and completely destroyed. Ideology divorced entirely from reality had led Germany to arm its greatest enemy with its most talented minds. Native American code talkers provided unbreakable battlefield communications that completely baffled enemy intelligence efforts throughout the war. Approximately 400 to 420 Navajo Marines developed and operationally used a sophisticated code based on their native language. Japanese cryptographers, among the absolute best in the world, never successfully broke the Navajo Code despite intensive, sustained efforts. They couldn't even identify what language was being spoken in intercepted transmissions. At Iwo Jima, 6 Navajo Code Talkers sent and received over 800 messages in the first 2 days of the brutal battle, all without a single error in transmission or reception. Major Howard Connor, 5th Marine Division Signal Officer at Iwo Jima, later stated bluntly that, were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima, acknowledging their absolutely critical contribution. Beyond the Navajo, approximately 534 total Native American code talkers from 14 to 15 different tribes served in both European and Pacific theaters of operation. 14 Comanche Code Talkers served specifically in Europe and participated in the Normandy invasion itself. They provided secure tactical communications during the Utah Beach landing and subsequent operations, transmitting critical messages about German positions, troop movements, and tactical situations that simply could not be intercepted and successfully decoded by German intelligence. The supposedly racially inferior Native Americans had created a communications system that the most sophisticated enemy intelligence organizations in the world could not crack. Japanese-American soldiers proved their loyalty and exceptional courage despite suffering the profound injustice of internment camps that imprisoned their families without trial. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed entirely of Japanese Americans, became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in United States military history, according to official Army designation. The statistics are absolutely extraordinary. 21 Medals of Honor, with 20 upgraded in 2000 from original awards during the war, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 9,186 Purple Hearts, over 18,000 individual decorations total from a unit that initially began with just 4,000 men. The 422nd suffered an almost incomprehensible 314% casualty rate, meaning the unit had to be completely replaced more than 3 times over throughout its combat service. From an original strength of 4,000 men, approximately 14,000 to 18,000 served in the 442nd during the war, with 680 plus killed in action. The rescue of the Lost Battalion in October 1944 perfectly exemplifies their extraordinary sacrifice. When 201 soldiers from the 141st Regiment of the 36th Texas Division were completely surrounded in the Vosges Mountains, the 442nd was ordered to break through German lines and rescue them. Over 5 desperate days from October 26th to 30th, 1944, the 442nd suffered over 800 casualties, more than 140 killed and over 600 wounded, to rescue 211 trapped men. Company K was reduced to just 17 riflemen. Company I was reduced to only 8 riflemen capable of fighting. The unit received 5 Presidential Unit citations in 20 days for actions officially designated as one of the top 10 battles in United States Army history. These Japanese-American soldiers fought with extraordinary courage while their own families were imprisoned behind barbed wire in internment camps scattered across the American West. They fought not because they were treated fairly, they weren't, but because they loved their country deeply and wanted desperately to prove their loyalty beyond any possible doubt. Nazi racial ideology insisted dogmatically that racial mixing and diversity made nations fundamentally weak. The 442nd proved decisively that loyalty and courage have absolutely nothing to do with racial purity. Hispanic Americans served in numbers significantly disproportionate to their population percentage. An estimated 400,000 to 500,000 Hispanic Americans served in the military, despite constituting a much smaller percentage of the total United States population. Company E of the 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Division, was an entirely Mexican-American unit recruited from El Paso, Texas. Company E was among the very first American troops to land in Italy at Salerno. During the disastrous Rapido River crossing on January 20th to 22nd, 1944, one of the costliest river crossings in American military history. Of 154 men who successfully crossed the river, only 27 returned alive. The unit was virtually destroyed, fighting at one of the war's most costly and controversial operations. Those who somehow survived continued fighting at Monte Cassino and throughout the brutal Italian campaign, demonstrating courage and tenacity that matched any unit in the entire American Army. Women fundamentally transformed American war production from a theoretical impossibility to documented reality. The female workforce increased dramatically from 27% in 1940 to 36 to about 37% by 1945. Approximately 6 million women entered the workforce during the war years alone. In aircraft manufacturing specifically, women comprised an astounding 65% of the industry workforce by 1943, up from merely 1% before the war began. At Willow Run's B-24 bomber plant, up to one-third of the 42,000-person workforce were women. More than 15,000 female workers built the bombers that would systematically pound German positions in Normandy and across occupied Europe. These women learned genuinely complex industrial skills, operated heavy machinery safely, read technical blueprints accurately, and maintained rigorous quality control on weapons systems that required precision manufacturing to function properly. Rosie the Riveter became an iconic propaganda symbol, but she represented real women with real skills doing absolutely essential war work. They welded steel, assembled engines, installed electrical systems, and tested aircraft. They worked in shipyards building Liberty ships and destroyers. They manufactured ammunition, assembled rifles, and packed parachutes. Without women workers entering the industrial workforce in massive numbers, American industrial production could never have reached the levels that completely overwhelmed German production capacity. But American production didn't only equip American forces. Through the Lend-Lease program, America became the arsenal of democracy for all Allied nations fighting against the Axis powers. The scale of American aid to Britain and the Soviet Union demonstrated industrial capacity that German planners had insisted was physically impossible to achieve. Britain received over $31 billion in Lend-Lease aid, equivalent to approximately $540 billion in current dollar value. This included aircraft, tanks, trucks, food supplies, raw materials, and industrial equipment. Without American supplies arriving continuously, Britain could not have continued fighting the war after 1941. The Royal Air Force flew American-built aircraft. British soldiers drove American trucks. British civilians ate food shipped directly from America. British factories processed American raw materials into finished weapons. The Soviet Union received over $11 billion in Lend-Lease aid, equivalent to approximately $190 billion in today's currency. This included 49,000 trucks and jeeps, 12,000 armored vehicles, including 7,000 tanks, 11,000 aircraft, 1.75 million tons of food, enough to provide half a pound of food daily to every Soviet soldier for the entire war, 15 million pairs of boots, and 13 million winter coats. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who commanded the final assault on Berlin, acknowledged frankly after the war that, without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with. The Red Army's mobility in its great offensives from 1943 to 1945 depended heavily on American Studebaker trucks. Soviet factories focused their production on tanks and artillery, while American industry provided essential transport and logistics support. American industrial production supported not just American forces, but the entire Allied war effort simultaneously across multiple continents. Stalin himself, despite his complicated and suspicious relationship with the Western Allies, admitted in a 1943 toast that, without American production, the Allies would have lost the war. Even allowing for diplomatic exaggeration, the fundamental point remained absolutely valid. American industrial capacity was sustaining three major Allied powers simultaneously, while also fighting a two-front war against both Germany and Japan. German intelligence officers knew these production numbers. They read detailed reports of American production statistics and Lend-Lease shipments. But Nazi ideology provided a convenient framework that systematically reinterpreted all contradictory evidence. The numbers must be grossly exaggerated, they reasoned. American production quality was supposedly inferior. Allied unity would inevitably crack under sustained pressure. The Allies would eventually turn on each other, especially the capitalist democracies and the communist Soviet Union. Every single assumption proved catastrophically wrong. American production numbers were not exaggerated. They were actually understated in some categories. American equipment quality was generally excellent, often superior to German equivalents in reliability and ease of mass production. Allied unity held firmly together despite genuine tensions because all three major powers clearly recognized that defeating Nazi Germany was absolutely essential to their survival. And the supposedly impossible feat of simultaneously supplying multiple Allied nations while fielding massive American forces across two theaters was accomplished through systematic industrial organization and logistical planning that German authorities had genuinely believed no messy democracy could possibly achieve. The German intelligence failure extended far beyond just the immediate invasion. Throughout 1943 and 1944, German military intelligence received consistently accurate reports of American production capacity, force buildup in Britain, and invasion preparations. The numbers were readily available. The evidence was crystal clear. But at every level of command, Nazi ideology systematically filtered the interpretation of intelligence data. Reports of American production were routinely dismissed as Allied propaganda deliberately designed to intimidate Germany into premature surrender. When intelligence officers dutifully reported that America produced nearly 30,000 tanks in 1943 alone, senior commanders flatly refused to believe it. That single number exceeded total German tank production for the entire war spanning 6 years. It must be grossly exaggerated, they reasoned, or it must include training vehicles and obsolete equipment. It simply could not possibly represent genuine combat-capable armor. When reconnaissance flights photographed endless rows of Liberty ships filling American ports, the photographs were analyzed professionally, but the strategic implications were systematically dismissed. Yes, America built ships quickly, but surely they were poorly constructed, liable to break apart in rough seas. German naval intelligence knew better from captured equipment analysis. They had captured American equipment and tested it thoroughly. But ideology consistently overrode evidence at command levels where strategic decisions were actually made. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, provided detailed and often remarkably accurate intelligence throughout the war. But Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who headed the Abwehr, was himself increasingly disillusioned with Nazi leadership. The intelligence his service painstakingly provided was systematically disregarded whenever it contradicted fundamental Nazi assumptions about enemy capabilities. By 1944, accurate intelligence that might have helped Germany respond more effectively to Allied operations was being routinely ignored or deliberately reinterpreted to fit ideological preconceptions. This pattern of ignoring contradictory evidence wasn't unique to Nazi Germany, but the consequences were particularly severe in this case. When your entire ideology tells you that racially diverse democracies cannot effectively wage war, and the evidence clearly shows them mobilizing unprecedented industrial and military power, you face a stark choice. Accept the evidence and fundamentally revise your ideology, or reject the evidence and maintain your comfortable beliefs. Nazi leadership consistently chose the latter option and paid for it with total, unconditional defeat. Nazi racial ideology insisted that diversity equaled weakness, that racial mixing produced inferior soldiers, that Jewish influence corrupted nations beyond repair, that women belonged only in traditional domestic roles. American reality systematically disproved every single claim with overwhelming evidence. The very diversity Nazis mocked relentlessly became a strategic advantage that monolithic, supposedly racially pure Nazi Germany could never match or replicate. Japanese Americans who spoke Japanese fluently staffed military intelligence units, translating captured documents and intercepted communications. Navajo Marines provided unbreakable battlefield communications. Jewish refugee scientists built atomic weapons. African American drivers kept Patton's army supplied with fuel and ammunition. Women built the aircraft and ships that achieved Allied air and naval superiority. Hispanic Americans fought and died in the Italian mountains. Native Americans transmitted secure tactical communications that couldn't be broken. America's pluralistic society successfully mobilized talents and perspectives that Germany's rigid racial ideology made fundamentally impossible. Every principle of Nazi racial theory translated directly into strategic disadvantage. Every assumption about diversity as inherent weakness proved catastrophically wrong in practice. The half-Judaized and half-negrified nation that Hitler contemptuously dismissed had become an industrial and military colossus that Germany had absolutely no hope of defeating. Before D-Day, German defenders had already experienced American industrial might firsthand through the strategic bombing campaign. From 1943 onward, American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators systematically pounded German cities and industrial centers in daylight raids, while British bombers struck at night. The 8th Air Force, based in England, grew from a handful of bombers in 1942 to over 200,000 personnel and thousands of heavy bombers by 1944. On single raids, the 8th Air Force could dispatch over 1,000 heavy bombers escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustang fighters. Each bomber carried up to 8,000 pounds of bombs. A 1,000-bomber raid delivered 8 million pounds of high explosives on German targets in a single mission. German industrial workers experienced American air power firsthand as factories were systematically destroyed. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, the aircraft factories at Regensburg, the synthetic oil refineries that Germany desperately needed for continued operations. Raid after raid, month after month, American bombers and their crews paid a terrible price in blood. But the cumulative effect was absolutely devastating to German war production capacity. By spring 1944, German soldiers manning Normandy fortifications could look up and see American bombers passing overhead on their way to Germany. Hundreds of aircraft in tight formations, silver dots against blue sky, heading east to drop tons of explosives on German cities. Those bombers represented the same industrial capacity that would soon deliver an invasion force larger than anything in human history. The Luftwaffe, once absolute master of European skies, had been ground down by relentless attrition. Experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements could possibly be trained. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Manufacturing could not keep pace with mounting losses. By D-Day, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength, completely unable to contest Allied air superiority over France. German defenders in Normandy knew exactly what Allied air supremacy meant. They had seen it in North Africa, where Rommel's forces were pounded relentlessly from the air. They had seen it in Italy, where Allied fighter bombers destroyed German supply columns at will, and they had experienced it themselves as Allied aircraft ranged freely over France, attacking any target that moved. The sky belonged to the Allies, and everyone knew it. By spring 1944, the question was not whether the Allies would invade France, but when and where exactly. German intelligence knew an invasion was coming. Rommel and von Rundstedt disagreed sharply on defensive strategy, but agreed absolutely that stopping the invasion at the beaches was essential. If the Allies established a firm beachhead and broke out into France, Germany lacked the resources to push them back. Rommel wanted panzer divisions positioned close to the coast to counterattack immediately. Von Rundstedt preferred holding armor in reserve to counterattack once the invasion location was confirmed. Both strategies might have worked if Germany possessed air superiority and freedom of movement. But Rommel recognized what von Rundstedt initially underestimated. Allied air superiority would make large-scale armored movement suicidal. In his pre-invasion assessment, Rommel wrote prophetically about Allied air power. Anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps, and with the same chances of success. This wasn't pessimism, it was realism. Rommel had experienced Allied air power in North Africa and knew exactly what was coming. On June 5, 1944, weather forecasts predicted 2 weeks of conditions unsuitable for invasion. High winds, rough seas, and heavy clouds would make large-scale amphibious operations impossible. Rommel, believing the weather provided a window of safety, left France to celebrate his wife Lucy's 50th birthday on June 6th. Many German officers relaxed their vigilance, convinced that invasion was not imminent. German intelligence had actually intercepted Allied code messages on June 1st and June 5th. The first 2 lines of Verlaine's poem, Chanson d'automne, had been identified by Admiral Canaris as the signal for invasion within 48 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Meyer alerted 15th Army, telephoned Rommel's and von Rundstedt's headquarters, and teletyped General Jodl. The chain of command failed catastrophically. Jodl did nothing, assuming von Rundstedt was alerted. Von Rundstedt did nothing, assuming Rommel was alerted. Rommel either never received the warning or was focused on his wife's birthday. The 15th Army went on alert but took no significant action. Other commands received no proper warning. They taught only German forces fully alerted to imminent invasion through intelligence that proved completely accurate failed to act decisively because each level of command assumed someone else was handling it. But Allied meteorologists had identified a brief window of marginally acceptable weather on June 6th. General Dwight Eisenhower made the historic decision to proceed. The invasion was on. In the darkness before dawn on June 6, 1944, over 23,000 Allied airborne troops dropped into Normandy or arrived by glider. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions jumped over the Cotentin Peninsula behind Utah Beach. British and Canadian paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division secured the eastern flank near Caen. Their mission: secure key bridges, disable coastal batteries, and disrupt German reinforcements. The airborne drops were scattered and chaotic. High winds and German anti-aircraft fire dispersed paratroopers across miles of Norman countryside. Some landed in flooded fields and drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others landed far from their designated zones and had to navigate enemy territory in darkness. Despite the chaos, small groups of paratroopers accomplished critical objectives, seizing bridges and blocking roads that would have allowed rapid German reinforcement of the beaches. At 05:45, still before dawn, naval bombardment began with devastating effect. 84 warships, plus dozens of landing craft equipped with guns and rockets, opened fire on German coastal defenses. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous thunder of explosions that shook the earth and shattered the pre-dawn darkness. USS Nevada, which had been damaged at Pearl Harbor and returned to service, fired 337 rounds of 14-inch shells and nearly 2,700 rounds from 5-inch guns at Utah Beach alone. HMS Belfast would fire over 400 6-inch shells over 33 days of support operations. HMS Ramillies fired over 1,000 shells from 15-inch main armament. German defenders in their fortifications experienced bombardment unlike anything they had encountered. Concrete bunkers shook and cracked, communications lines were severed, defensive positions were obliterated. At 06:30, the first assault waves hit the beaches. 132,715 seaborne troops would land on 5 beaches that day. The Americans assaulted Utah Beach on the Cotentin Peninsula and Omaha Beach between Vierville and Colville. The British attacked Gold and Sword beaches. The Canadians landed on Juno Beach. Each beach presented unique challenges and different levels of resistance. Utah Beach proved the least costly. Strong currents pushed landing craft 2,000 yards south of the planned landing site, accidentally avoiding the heaviest German defenses. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of President Theodore Roosevelt, and at 56, the oldest man in the assault force, led the 4th Infantry Division ashore. When he realized they had landed in the wrong location, he famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here." Utah Beach casualties were remarkably light, fewer than 200 killed, wounded, or missing out of over 23,000 troops landed. Omaha Beach became the bloodiest and most difficult landing. German defenses at Omaha were more extensive than intelligence had predicted. The 352nd Infantry Division defending Omaha was a higher quality unit than most static coastal divisions. Cliffs overlooked the beach, providing German defenders with commanding fields of fire. Rough seas swamped many landing craft and tanks equipped with flotation devices. The first assault waves at Omaha suffered devastating casualties. German machine gun and artillery fire swept the beach. Men huddled behind beach obstacles and the seawall, pinned down and unable to advance. Landing craft continued bringing reinforcements directly into a killing zone. For several hours, it appeared the Omaha Beach assault might fail completely. Commanders offshore considered evacuating survivors and shifting follow-on waves to other beaches. But small groups of American soldiers, led by junior officers and sergeants, began advancing up the bluffs. Engineers cleared obstacles despite heavy casualties. Naval destroyers moved dangerously close to shore, sometimes grounding themselves to provide direct fire support. Slowly, painfully, American forces clawed their way off Omaha Beach and secured the heights overlooking the landing area. By day's end, approximately 2,400 American casualties had been suffered at Omaha, but the beach was secured. The British and Canadian landings at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches faced varying levels of resistance. Gold Beach saw moderate opposition overcome by veteran British troops. Juno Beach presented difficult conditions with offshore reefs and strong defenses, but Canadian forces pushed inland rapidly once they cleared the beaches. Sword Beach, closest to Caen, faced determined German resistance, but British forces established a solid beachhead. Overhead, Allied air superiority was absolute and devastating. 11,590 Allied aircraft were available on D-Day, including 3,455 operational heavy bombers, 989 operational medium and light bombers, and 3,124 operational fighters. These aircraft flew 14,674 sorties on D-Day alone. For comparison, the Luftwaffe could field only 319 to 815 serviceable aircraft in all of Western France. The ratio was approximately 37 Allied sorties for every single German sortie. German pilots who attempted to interfere with the invasion were swarmed by Allied fighters. Luftwaffe fighter ace Joseph Priller famously made a single strafing run across Sword Beach with his wingmen, the only German air attack on the beaches that day. 2 aircraft against 11,590. German soldiers defending Normandy watched Allied aircraft fill the sky in formations that stretched from horizon to horizon. They saw their own positions destroyed by dive bombers. They watched German reinforcements strafed and destroyed on roads leading to the front. They experienced what Rommel had predicted. Fighting with modern weapons against an enemy in complete command of the air meant fighting with the same handicaps savages faced against modern European troops. The total invasion force comprised 6,939 vessels. This included 1,213 naval combat ships, 4,126 landing ships and landing craft, 736 ancillary craft, and 864 merchant vessels. Naval personnel totaled 195,700 sailors from multiple Allied nations. By the end of D-Day, approximately 156,000 to 160,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy, 73,000 Americans, 83,115 British and Canadian. German defenders had been overwhelmed by the scale and coordination of an operation that Nazi ideology had insisted was beyond Allied capability. Germany had nominally 58 divisions in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, approximately 850,000 troops spread over 2,000 miles of coastline. But quality varied dramatically. Many were static divisions lacking transport. About half included Osttruppen, poor-quality units formed from former Soviet prisoners of war pressed into German service. These were not the elite panzer and infantry divisions that had conquered France in 1940. Luftsportgruppen Corps, commanded by General Erich Marx, directly faced all 5 invasion beaches with only 3 divisions, 2 of them static. When the invasion began, Marx understood immediately what was at stake. When ordering Colonel Hermann von Oppeln-Bronikowski to lead 21st Panzer Division's counterattack, Marx stated bluntly, "If you don't succeed in throwing the British into the sea, we shall have lost the war." The 21st Panzer Division represented the only German armored counterattack on D-Day itself. The division reached the Channel coast around 20 hours, splitting Juno and Sword beaches. For a brief moment, German tanks had reached their objective, but the division lacked infantry support and reinforcements to exploit its success. Massive Allied naval gunfire targeted any German movement. The sudden appearance of 250 Allied gliders overhead, threatening German rear areas, forced withdrawal by 21 hours. Hitler slept late on June 6th. Panzer reserves were not released until 15 hours, a critical 12-hour delay that allowed Allied forces to consolidate their beachheads. The divided command structure that Rommel and von Rundstedt had warned about paralyzed German response during the crucial first hours when rapid counterattack might have made a difference. When Chief of Staff General Hans Speidel telephoned Rommel with news of major Allied landings, Rommel repeatedly muttered while rushing back to Normandy, "How stupid of me! How stupid of me!" He arrived at La Roche-Guyon headquarters around 22 hours on June 6th. By then, 156,000 Allied troops had landed and established beachheads. It was already too late. By the end of June, 850,000 Allied troops, 570,000 tons of supplies, and 150,000 vehicles had crossed the Channel. The Germans were outnumbered, outgunned, and paralyzed by Allied air and naval superiority. Field Marshal von Rundstedt filed his formal 3,100-word assessment on June 20th, just 2 weeks after D-Day. His report identified the primary factor in Allied success with brutal honesty. The enemy's complete mastery in the air had rendered German defensive doctrine obsolete. Von Rundstedt noted that 29,000 Allied sorties were counted in 2.5 days, as deep as 65 miles from the enemy bridgehead. Of these, about 2,300 aircraft a day dive bomb and strafe every movement on the ground, even a single soldier. Allied naval guns had made the movement of tanks by day in open country impossible. The enemy carries the battle right into the home battlefront with his tactical bombers, von Rundstedt wrote, to interrupt supplies and replacements and cause so many casualties in rolling stock and motorized columns that supply and replacements have become a very serious problem. By June 29th, von Rundstedt's frustration boiled over. When Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel asked, "What shall we do?" von Rundstedt replied with shocking bluntness, "Make peace, you idiots. What else can you do?" He was dismissed July 4th, officially due to age and ill health. In reality, he had recognized what Hitler refused to accept. The war in the West was lost. Germany no longer possessed the military capacity to defeat the forces arrayed against it. In the weeks and months following D-Day, German military commanders continued filing reports that acknowledged their impossible situation. General Erich Marx, who had commanded Elchsquaf Corps facing all 5 invasion beaches, was killed on June 12th by Allied air attack. He received posthumous oak leaves to his Knight's Cross for his role in containing the Allied invasion during the vital first week, though containing was perhaps too generous a term for the desperate defensive battles that only delayed inevitable Allied victory. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel attempted to convince Hitler that the war in the West was lost and that Germany should seek peace before total destruction. On July 15, 1944, Rommel sent Hitler a personal letter stating that the situation on the Normandy front is growing worse every day and is rapidly approaching a crisis. The unequal struggle is approaching its end. 2 days later, on July 17th, Rommel's staff car was strafed by an Allied fighter. The attack left Rommel with severe head injuries that ended his active military service. On October 14, 1944, implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, Rommel was forced to commit suicide. The Desert Fox, who had recognized American capabilities early and whose tactical assessments proved consistently accurate, was destroyed by the regime he had served. Von Rundstedt, dismissed in July for his "Make Peace" comment, was actually brought back as Commander-in-Chief West in September 1944. Hitler had few other commanders with von Rundstedt's experience, and desperate times called for experienced leadership despite ideological unreliability. Von Rundstedt commanded during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Germany's last major offensive in the West, which ultimately failed due to the same factors that had doomed German efforts since D-Day: insufficient fuel, limited air support, and overwhelming Allied material superiority. By May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, the evidence of American industrial might was undeniable, even to the most fanatical Nazi believers. American, British, and Soviet forces occupied Germany. German cities lay in ruins from years of Allied bombing. German industry was destroyed. The Wehrmacht was shattered. And everywhere German soldiers looked, they saw American equipment in quantities that made German wartime production appear microscopic by comparison. The transformation from Hitler's January 1942 dismissal of America as half-Judaized and half-negrified to von Rundstedt's June 1944 assessment of complete enemy mastery represented more than military defeat. It demonstrated how ideology, when divorced from empirical reality, produces catastrophic strategic miscalculation. Nazi leaders genuinely believed their racial theories. They convinced themselves that racial diversity weakened nations, that Jewish influence corrupted societies, that democracy made countries militarily impotent, that mass production of consumer goods could not translate to weapons manufacture. These were not cynical propaganda lies. They were core beliefs that shaped German strategic assessment. The evidence of American industrial capacity was available throughout 1942 and 1943. Germany possessed excellent intelligence services. They knew American production numbers. But Nazi ideology provided a framework that reinterpreted evidence. American production was dismissed as inferior quality. American soldiers were dismissed as poorly motivated. American society was dismissed as fundamentally divided and weak. Ideology functioned as a filter that made contradictory evidence invisible or unimportant. By June 6, 1944, reality could no longer be denied or reinterpreted. When 156,000 troops landed from 6,139 ships under cover of 11,490 aircraft, when Allied naval guns made German tank movement suicidal, when Allied air superiority achieved ratios of 37-1, when American logistics transported 4 to 12,193 tons of supplies over 82 days to sustain rapid advance across France. The gap between Nazi ideology and empirical reality became unbridgeable. Rommel's pre-invasion prediction proved prophetically accurate. Allied air superiority exposed panzers to devastating fighter-bomber attacks, preventing their movement exactly as he had warned. The strategic debate between Rommel's armor at the coast strategy and von Rundstedt's armor in reserve strategy became irrelevant when Allied air and naval power made large-scale German armored counterattacks impossible regardless of positioning. The final bitter irony completed the circle of German self-destruction. Nazi racial policies directly strengthened America while weakening Germany. Jewish scientists fleeing persecution built the Manhattan Project that would create atomic weapons. German military intelligence lost countless talented analysts and codebreakers to racial purges. The SS diverted scarce military resources to genocide. Occupied territories that might have provided willing labor and even military recruits instead became sources of resistance and partisan warfare. Every principle of Nazi racial ideology translated into strategic disadvantage. Hitler's dismissal of America was not a random insult. It flowed logically from Nazi racial theory. That same theory predicted American collapse, industrial inadequacy, military incompetence, and societal fragmentation. American reality systematically falsified every prediction. The half-Judaized and half-negrified nation that Hitler dismissed in January 1942 had become, by June 1944, the industrial and military power that German commanders recognized could no longer be defeated. The beaches of Normandy became the graveyard of Nazi illusions. There on the sand and in the surf, German defenders confronted the reality they had denied for so long. America was not weak. Its society was not fractured beyond recovery. Its industrial power was not propaganda, but frightening reality. And perhaps most important, the soldiers who came ashore that day, soldiers from every American state and dozens of ethnic backgrounds, fought with courage and determination that equaled anything German soldiers could muster. The German soldiers defending Normandy learned in the most terrible way that propaganda is a poor substitute for truth. The America they had been taught to despise and dismiss was, in fact, a colossus. The racial diversity they had been told made America weak had made it strong. The democracy they had been assured was chaotic and inefficient had proven itself capable of extraordinary organization and focus. The industrial capacity they had been promised was exaggerated, was, if anything, understated in intelligence reports that had seemed too extreme to believe. D-Day was not the end of the war. 11 months of brutal fighting remained before German surrender in early May 1945. German soldiers continued to fight with skill and courage, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The industrial and military might arrayed against Germany was simply too great. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, the fortress of Europe had been entered, and the armies that came ashore in Normandy would not stop until they met Soviet forces in the heart of Berlin. Adolf Hitler's contemptuous dismissal of America as half-Judaized and half-negrified stands as one of history's great miscalculations. Those words, spoken with such certainty in January 1942, revealed the fatal flaw at the heart of Nazi ideology. The racial theories that animated the Third Reich prevented German leadership from understanding that strength comes from multiple sources: industrial capacity, technological innovation, social cohesion, moral purpose, and yes, diversity of talent and perspective. America possessed all these strengths. Nazi Germany blinded by ideology, could not see them until it was too late. For 3 years, from December 1941, when Hitler declared war on America, to June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, Nazi leadership had clung to the belief that America's supposed weaknesses would prevent it from playing a decisive role in Europe. Those 3 years allowed America to build the largest military force in its history, supported by the greatest industrial mobilization the world had ever seen. When that force finally arrived on the beaches of Normandy, it arrived with a power that German propaganda had insisted was impossible. The shock that German defenders experienced when they saw the Allied armada approaching Normandy was the shock of reality colliding with ideology. They had believed the propaganda about American weakness. They had accepted the comfortable lie that their racial superiority would guarantee victory. The thousands of ships and aircraft that filled sea and sky that June morning represented truth they could no longer deny. Von Rundstedt's advice to "make peace, you idiots," acknowledged the conclusion that evidence had been screaming since American production began ramping up in 1942. Nazi ideology had led Germany into a war it could not win against an enemy it had fundamentally misunderstood. The supposedly weak and divided nation had mobilized power on a scale that dwarfed anything the Third Reich could match. The lesson extends far beyond World War II. Ideology divorced from reality. Beliefs maintained despite contradictory evidence. Strategic planning based on wishful thinking rather than honest assessment. These produce catastrophic failure, regardless of how sincerely held the beliefs may be. Nazi racial theory was not just morally abhorrent, it was strategically suicidal. It led German leadership to systematically underestimate their enemies and overestimate their own capabilities. The Americans, British, and Canadians who landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, were not supermen. They were ordinary people from democratic societies who had mobilized their industrial capacity, organized their military forces, and found the courage to cross the Channel into the teeth of German defenses. They came from every background, every ethnicity, every region. They proved through victory what Nazi ideology had denied. Diversity is strength. Democracy can fight and win total war. Free societies possess advantages that dictatorships can never match. The German officers who stared in disbelief at the Allied armada on June 6, 1944, were witnessing the consequences of their leadership's delusions. They had been told for 3 years that America was weak, divided, and incapable of sustained military effort. They had been promised that German superiority would prevail. Instead, they faced an enemy who brought to battle a level of material power that made German resistance ultimately futile. 3 years after Hitler's contemptuous dismissal of the half-Judaized and half-negrified America, his own commanders were advising him to make peace because the war was lost. The scale of American industrial and military power that materialized in Normandy had proved every Nazi assumption catastrophically wrong. Ideology had met reality, and reality had won decisively. The story of Nazi Germany's fatal underestimation of America stands as an enduring warning. Believe your own propaganda at your peril. Ignore evidence that contradicts your worldview at catastrophic cost. Underestimate your enemies based on prejudice rather than realistic assessment, and you may find yourself staring in shock at a horizon filled with ships and aircraft that prove everything you believed was wrong. The officers looking across the English Channel on that June morning in 1944 learned that lesson in the harshest way possible, as their world and their ideology crumbled before the overwhelming reality of American power.